Bit of an unusual start to a YouTube video, but this is what I started off working with, and this is what it ended up being. It's a longer video, but I wanted to get it all in one go. It's not a tutorial, it's just how I approach this build. I'd really appreciate it if you watched and left your comments down below. Thanks very much. So there I was the other day, sitting on my throne, and no, not that one. That's more like it. And I was going on my phone looking through Marketplace, as you do. I found this free pine kitchen table and decided to send them a nice message. And I was extremely happy to find out that I could go and pick that bad boy up straight away. So that's exactly what I did. Getting home, I managed to get it out of the car and into the workshop pretty happily. Took a little bit of effort, but we got there in the end. Then I needed to figure out exactly where this was going. Now, this is going to be a screw box for my Forgefix screws, so it's going on the back wall underneath the French cleats that I made some time ago. Now, at this point, I thought I was being clever. I was measuring things and I was counting things and I was doing all the things you should do to make some plans. Unfortunately, this was the one and only time I opened that book up. Looking at what I had to work with, I could turn it over pretty easily because it was pine. Saw a little fella on there at this point in time. There we go, look. Little fella like that. So he had to get ejected nicely from the workshop and away you go. I used to be terrified of spiders. Taking things apart was fairly straightforward. It was nice and easy to see exactly what was going on. I did wonder if I was going to use that drawer again, but ended up not doing so. I know not everybody enjoys an impact driver, but it certainly makes taking things apart a lot easier when you do have one. Now, you do have to watch out for these little fellas because they're like little razor blades that just want to damage you when you try and take them out, and they're not the easiest. But they are easy to tear in half, so if you can get the full length out, job's a good one. But what I did was I just made sure that all the bits that I took out were the same length, and any bits that weren't, then I went back to them and tried to dig out what was left behind. And absolutely no surprise that I managed to damage myself with one of those little bad boys, and got a little bit of claret all over the place. I managed to get back to things pretty sharpish though, and let me tell you, not all heroes wear capes. I'm a brave little soldier. After making sure that there weren't any bits of metal stuck in the underside of the tabletop, I then decided to carefully cut it down on the table saw and make it into more manageable pieces. I didn't worry about where the actual pine joints were, if you like, originally. I just went at it because I figured it would probably be nice and strong as it was. Straightforward then, just to take the sides off because they've got those curves going on. We don't need any of that nonsense in the project, and everything worked out fine. I measured out the rough lengths that I wanted to go with. This was kind of what I had in my head with the plans and what have you, but to be honest with you, it's relatively arbitrary as long as they were all the same. I can never figure out whether I want to be doing the drawers first or the cabinet first, but here we are. I still haven't made myself a cross-cut sled. Now I've got new size mitre slots in this saw, so I'm just lining up my mitre gauge with the blade to make sure that it is straight and everything is sitting where it should be. At this point, I'm measuring the distance between the blade and my fence so I can cut these pieces down in half so I can use my thickness planer. Now, you don't have to use a thickness planer. You don't even have to be cutting this in half. You could strip the sides or the faces with sanding. You could hand plane them. You could do all sorts of things. But because I haven't got a benchtop lunchbox thicknesser, I've only got my Titan thickness planer, then it means that I have to cut these things down smaller so they fit through the little bad boy. Now, right here, I just had an epiphany because it was got quite a thick tabletop at about 1 inch. So I figured I could cut that all in half and get twice the amount of wood, which will make the table go twice as far as it would have done. Now, my fence on this particular bandsaw is garbage. I love the bandsaw, but I hate the fence. Now, before anyone gets on at me, yes, I know there's not a blade guard on there. I forgot to put it back on, and I will do at some point in time. through the thicknesser they go. I've managed to do this one outside because I've not sorted out my dust collection for it yet. That's on a video to come in the very near future. But even though this is a cheapie, this little tie-in kind of does the job you need. After going through the thicknesser, I didn't have to worry quite as much about grain pattern, I don't think, because it's unlikely to do extra cupping and so on now that they've gone through the thicknesser because of the age of the wood and the fact that it's been in someone's house for ages. However, this whole section could have been cut out if I'd have had a sort of a workbench thicknesser that could have taken like a 30 centimetre board, but I didn't, so we have to glue these things together again. Now I'm using pipe clamps, which, to be honest, I want a lot more of. I've got a couple more sets of the ends, the red bits that you see on screen, but I haven't got any more threaded pipe at the moment. And weirdly, in Norwich, it's really hard to get hold of, so I had to get these two pieces off of Amazon. But still, they're a lot cheaper option than going with parallel clamps. And to be fair, if you got your own pipe and you had a thread cutting kit for it, you could make your own pretty simply and very cost effectively. With the glue on the top and the bottom drying, I then turn my attention to cutting the wood down to make the sides for the box. I could have cut the pieces to length with a handsaw, however I chose to use the table saw. Now I'm using my little magnet thing that I talked about a little while ago on another video, and I'm using that as a stop block. It just about manages to catch hold of the side of my table there, which is pretty awesome. But yeah, this is just getting the lengths for the side pieces all sorted out. I then will be cutting these down in half, sort of thickness wise, to match that of the rest of the box as well. I cut a couple more bits of wood in exactly the same process, and then it was time to use the bench or the sander, the portable sander, to get rid of the saw marks and all that sort of stuff and get not a final finish surface, but a surface that was just looking a wee bit tidier. Now I'm using the little block or the planing stop that I have at the end of my bench to stop the wood going awry. However, what happens if you don't do that? Well, these sanders are quite excitable, and then whoops, there we go. You don't want that to happen. So make sure that it's properly locked down before you do this sort of nonsense. Now, I know I haven't got my dust collection on here, but that is something that I sort out later on. I'm wearing a mask at the time being, and please leave a comment down below if you can recommend any masks that are great if you wear glasses or don't steam up your safety specs, because I'm having a hell of a time trying to find something. Screaming in today too, you can see that I've got a dust collector adapter that I made and put together for my sander so I don't get crap everywhere again. And I'm going to take this level off, which I thought was a genius idea. However, it didn't do a brilliant job of making sure that things didn't move around while they were drying, but nothing that couldn't be fixed, and that's the main thing. With dust collection on this time and a mask, I decided to use the sander to try and flatten things out. Once again, I wouldn't have to do this if I had a wider benchtop thicknesser, but you make the best of things. There's always ways around stuff. Again, I could have hand planed this if I wanted to. All sorts of ways you could make sure everything is nice and flat and lovely. At this point, I'm just trying to get rid of glue lines, making sure there isn't a ridge in it, and all that sort of jazz. Took a little bit, but nothing massive. I know I said that I'm trying to use electrical tools more often, but I still had to do just a little bit of hand planing on this. I love hand planing. There's something super therapeutic about it, and the finish that you get from it is brilliant. It really is. As long as you've got a nice sharp blade, a little bit of work can really, really make something nice happen, you know? And yeah, I just enjoy it. Now I decided to try and just throw things together to give myself an idea if the size was going to be worthwhile and all that sort of stuff. And I'm pleased that I did. Look at the little concentration on my face. Look, absolutely horrific. Someone needs to iron that face, something chronic. Now, at this point in time, I'm actually putting a strengthener in, or I'm trying to measure up for a strengthener. I don't use that. I should have done. I didn't though. At this point, I decided to start cutting some rabbits or dados or whatever we're supposed to call them into the edges, just to give it some kind of form and to help it when it came to the glue up to make sure that it all sticks together really nicely. What I didn't expect when I was doing this is to actually find out that something was out of square. Now, I've measured this mitre gauge. Again, I'd measured the blade to make sure that it was exactly parallel to the mitre slots. But still, you might be able to see just there, it's off. And it took me absolutely ages to figure out what on earth was the problem with this. I think I got to around about this point and I just thought, it is what it is and I'll worry about tidying it up later, to be honest with you. So we're probably not 100% square, but never mind. But I'm using the chisel to make sure that I've got nice, smooth meeting surfaces, because when I was trying multiple cuts to try and make sure that I was square, it left a slight ridge because I'd changed the settings on the saw. So yeah, I just went through it with a chisel just to tidy everything up and make sure everything else was clean. And just as a safety precaution, kids, don't chisel towards your own hand. On this occasion, I didn't skewer myself, but I have done in the past. You'd think I'd learn, but no. Managed to get things as square as I could, and then did a little test fit to get a rough idea of if it was kind of going to go together or if things were going to be sticking out at weird angles. And, you know, it kind of came together. Kind of, but yeah, certainly not perfect. But again, at this stage, I thought I'll figure it out afterwards. It's not an ideal approach, to be honest with you, but I just couldn't figure out what was causing things to go out of square. You would think it would be straightforward. It really wasn't. Right, at this stage, what I'm doing is I'm measuring out the center point of this piece of wood, because I'm going to need to put a shelf in the middle of the whole thing, not vertically but horizontally, so I can put all the drawers on it. And yeah, I thought I was being relatively bright for a change and forward thinking by doing these sort of dados, but you know, it didn't work out too bad. I also did one for the actual back of the whole unit, thinking once again I could just plop in a supportive back piece, and then completely forgot to do it on anything else. So I did a bit of a weird joinery thing that you'll see later on to get around that. But, you know, we got there. Bit of shoulder plane action going on right there with my number 92, I think it is. And that just helps really clean up the edges. I'm trying to make sure that I creep up on the fit to make sure it doesn't overstress the wood, because it is softwood at the end of the day, and that's something that I could learn to really remember in the next section. I decided to use a hammer to try and knock things in. That's a really bad idea with softwood because you can't see it, but out of frame, well, there you go. That was the other side. This did not make me a happy boy at all. And it's one of those moments where you really question what you're doing with your life. I think the frustration got to me at this point because I tried gluing it together, and that's what I actually went with in the end. It was not a solid solution, and I should have really recut that side piece. But to be honest with you, I couldn't be bothered. I was frustrated, a little bit angry, and so I just went with it. And to be honest with you, it did work, although not ideal because it sort of kinked itself in when I was putting the whole thing together a little bit. So not ideal, and you can see that it's not great when I show you the actual box. I realised I didn't need to have one solid piece of wood on the inside to rest the drawers on, so I cut down these sections to make slats, so it helps save a little bit of wood in the process. You can see the section on the right is not really overly stable, and it's not ideal, so I should have redone it at this point. With the shell kind of done, it was time to start thinking about the drawers. So now I needed to measure things to be as accurate as I could do in order to figure out how far apart all the drawers were going to need to be, how big the drawers were going to be, and all that sort of stuff. And let me tell you, I'm not an overly good person when it comes to mathematics. So this was more of a challenge than you would expect. So step 2 was to put all the boxes of screws in front of the drawers so I could have a look and sort of visualise how they were going to be, not in those boxes, but how they were going to be spaced equally, kinda. But then I did get the book out again and I wrote down the sizes of drawers that I was going to be making sure that I had kind of similar sizes to the box they were in, but it was going to be longer, so that was all going to work out fine. So I had to figure out how much space I had at the top, how much space I had at the bottom, and away you go. Now you could have designed all of this way easier if you'd have thought about it first, but because I have no idea what I'm doing, this is the kind of weird way that I approached it. We got there in the end, though. And now it's just time to try and cut up as many pieces as possible so I can really batch out the drawers as much as I possibly could. More wood was needed, so out came one of the offcuts, and this table really is giving me a lot of wood, which is brilliant. Using the magnetic stop block again, this allowed me to cut down one of those strips, or I actually used a couple of these strips to cut into sections, and that will allow me to make the sides and the fronts and backs of all the drawers. I will have to obviously slice this down the middle again to make sure that I get two pieces out of each single piece of wood, if that makes sense. I make sure the blade height is the same as the thickness of the side pieces. Then I get an idea of how far in on the front and back sections I'm going to need to go. So I actually use the side piece there and put that between my fence and the blade, and that gives me a perfect thickness. I can then run each piece over the blade, give myself a short dado that's as far into that piece of wood as I need to go. And then once I've done all of that on all of the pieces, I can then move the fence just a wee bit closer and closer until finally I get the dado size that I'm hoping for. And then came about the laborious process of gluing up every single drawer and trying to make them as straight as possible. You can see in the middle that I've got a bit of a sort of an area of kinking, so I needed to figure that one out, and the best way of doing that, I figured, was to put a clamp around the outside. That would mean that the bar clamp tubes can actually help keep the sides all aligned as well, and that did kind of work, so yay me for that one. I'm not entirely sure if there's a better way of doing it. I'm confident there is, though. It did take ages though, and so for the larger drawers that are going on the bottom section, I decided getting the old pin nailer out was probably a good idea to help speed up the process. This kind of worked out okay. I used a couple of the squares that you normally kind of clamp into boxes and stuff on the insides and outsides of these, just put some squeeze clamps on them to hold them in place, and it did a fine job. It kept everything relatively square, which I was happy with, to be honest. I had more pine available, so I could have used it, but to be honest with you, I just wanted to get things moving along. So I had this really thin piece of old board that was used for something else at some point in time, and I figured it would be perfect for the bottoms of the drawers. But I must stress that I could have used the pine table if I'd have wanted to. I just couldn't be asked to machine it all down to being the thinness that it needed to be. Did a rough measure up to get the right sizes, and then I threw that through the table saw as well, so I got that, you know, what I needed to get. Now, to be honest with you, all of this was a bit slapdash. I should have been taking more care on this section so the drawers were a little bit nicer, but I didn't. I mean, it still works, but yeah, I would spend more time thinking about making drawers the next time. So I just put some glue on them and threw some pin nails in. Now, when I did my sort of very rough calculations of sizing, I didn't account for this base to make things a little bit taller, and I had to cut the top off some of the boxes afterwards. But again, I would highlight that don't get lazy with this like I did, and actually spend some time figuring out your dimensions, your sizes, and how you're going to make your drawers, because it will pay off in the end. It's just, for me, I got grumpy and annoyed and just wanted to get something done. I think if I were to change anything on this build, it would be the attention on these drawers, because, yeah, this is not the best, and it should have been, and I shouldn't have let my frustration kind of just win me over on that particular day. But, you know, you live and learn, and it's really difficult to make sure that you get nails into really thin bits of wood. Getting into gluing up the carcass, it's fairly straightforward. I tried to keep things as square as I could do. You can see that I've kind of set up a few of the squares on the side pieces there ready to go, and you know, it kind of worked, and I think preparation before these things is the way forward. Now you see all those little black nails underneath the glue bottle there. Well, I've clearly been watching too much Epic Upcycling on his channel because I thought, you know what, I'm going to make it look a little bit cool and a little bit aged by banging in these black nails and holding everything together instead of using the pin nailer. That'll be cool. And then I somehow didn't record any of it. So you'll see that there are some black nail heads in it on the next section, and that's why. Interestingly, didn't even think about the fact that these are black coated nails. So when I then sanded things, they went to silver. But, you know, moving on. It was then time for a spot of lunch just to let the glue dry. And when it had, it was then time to put things together and see if it was going to work. And let me tell you, at this point, I was relieved to see that I hadn't made a complete mess of everything. Remember earlier when I said that I'd done some weird joinery on the back section? Well, that's because I had those elongated sides, and I could have trimmed them to the same length as the top and the bottom and just stuck a piece of wood over the back, and that would have made life easier. But I thought I'd have a go at a bit of joinery just because why not? So what I'm doing here is just chiseling out little sections for those side pieces to nestle into. Obviously this back section is a bit of a thicker piece of the pine, and so I've got the space to do this. But I thought this was an interesting experiment. It's not something I've done before, and it was definitely worth a crack, because I think it came out to be okay in the end, to be honest with you. It sort of fits and does what I would hope it to do. At this point, it was the time to try and figure out what I was going to do for the drawer fronts and the pulls. I'd asked people's opinions on some kind of mock-ups that I'd put together on all my socials, and got those. But I came up with this in the end, and I really liked it. It was individual frames around a section, and then putting the sort of the horizontal wider puller in the middle of them. And when I put it up against the cupboard, or the unit, if you like, I thought it looked kind of cool, and it would slide in and out, and I would have to put a frame on the front of the unit, so when this particular part of the drawer went in, it would sort of match up and be flush with it. At this point, I was just checking to see if I wanted the handle in the middle or at the top. Here I've got a piece of pine that I've cut to be exactly the same as the piece that I used on the back. This hopefully will allow me to make a mitered cornered face frame for the box section, and also work as fronts for all the drawers. My idea being that the kerf of the saw would allow the spacing for each of those individual pieces, and it would all work out really well. Didn't do exactly that, but I'll explain that a little bit later. I measured the thickness of the box section, and then I just managed to scribe that all the way around the piece of pine, just to give me some level of accuracy. I didn't really need to go all the way around it because it's all the same, but that's what I did. Then it was off to the bandsaw, and I tried to measure things up to get them as accurate as I could. But once again, the fence on this particular saw is its biggest issue. It's a truly awful fence, but I managed to get something close, and that was going to be good enough for me. Getting the longer pieces, I managed to take them across to my shooting board, cut them down with the little footprint saw that I did a review on a while ago, and then I got one of my little block plane together, just to really tidy this up, because I really wanted to make a half decent job at miters. And I don't know about you, but I am historically pretty damn bad at them. But this is a solid way of making things happen, and yeah, it does a grand job. I clamped the top piece on, and the bottom piece is there at the bottom of the drawers, as you can see. And I'm just cutting some side pieces now that are going to be the right height. So I'm kind of eyeballing it. And if anything, I go a little bit oversized because it's nice and easy to trim back. Then it's back over to the shooting board in order to cut and then plane the sections to get as close to perfect 45 degrees as I possibly can. Once I've done that, I can offer up each side section and see how close I've got it. And then all I've got to do is just get it back on the shooting board, just plane away really small pieces of it, slowly sneak up on it, and then I get a pretty decent fit, to be honest with you. I'm really happy with that result. I then simply glued and brad nailed it in place. A bit of sanding with the 120 grit from the Smurdex abrasive discs that I get from eBrasives in the UK. And then it was a case of measuring up the final piece to get an idea of where I wanted to cut it down the middle to allow me to create two sections that I could then cut the drawers from. And poof, just like that, there we go. The two sections that I've now got to cut into the individual drawer fronts. Unfortunately, when I'd cut the two sections, they weren't exactly the same width, so it was time to just plane them down so they were the same. I measured the piece of wood, divided that into 6 because I wanted 6 drawer fronts from it, and then got onto the bandsaw, used my fence as a stop block, and then I just went through and cut off each individual drawer front, and that gave me them all being exactly the same. I was pretty lucky with guessing the width of the kerf of the saw blade here. I used 2 playing cards at the bottom and 2 at each side just to measure out the drawer front. You can see my hand at the back there, just making sure the drawer is pushing through from the rear, and that's why I haven't attached the back section to the box yet. This is where I was making a mistake. So I used super glue or CA glue to make sure that the fronts of the drawers stuck onto the drawers themselves. I didn't actually do anything else other than that, which I may go back and put screws in at some point in time. But the eagle-eyed and more forward-thinking than I would see this and realise that I wouldn't be able to do the framing that I'd hoped to do on the drawer fronts because the thickness of these fronts was already taking up all the space that I had. So there was no way that I was going to put that framing on. But I had another idea for that. I then did exactly the same with the bottom piece, other than dividing it into 3 as opposed to the 6, obviously. And it was around about here that I definitely realised that I was not going to be able to do the frames on the front of the drawer fronts that I'd sort of I'll put a picture up here. And yeah, I couldn't do that without cutting those drawer fronts in half again, otherwise they wouldn't be flush. So, you know, I just went with it and thought we'll give everything a bit of an overall sanding to get rid of some of the roughness. You can see on that side that I am still using the side that was broken that I glued together, which is not good enough really. I should have sorted that out and replaced that with a proper bit of wood that wasn't broken. But there you go, you live and learn, and I just wanted to get this project finished. It has taken me so long to get to this point. It was obscene. I screwed the back to the box, and I did that using a screw on each length. And normally I wouldn't have to worry too much about drilling first for Forgefix screws, but I wanted to countersink them and I wanted to make sure that things looked relatively tidy. So also the screws that I've got are quite large, and I'm going into quite a small, thin piece of wood, so I didn't want to kind of overstress it unnecessarily. Bin bag down to protect the workbench. I have no idea why I did that, but you know, it happens. And then I've got my painting pyramids, which are highly dangerous, just screws in blocks of wood, and that'll keep things off the deck as I'm staining. I'm using this golden oak stuff that I got, Little Fair's golden oak water stain. I got this years ago and stained an IKEA kind of one of those little drawer units, and I really like the look of it, so I thought I'd use that on this one. The original idea for this unit was that it was going to have sort of an aged antique look, so I wasn't being too precious about how I applied this because most of it would get sanded back anyway, and my thought process was that I was going to build it up in layers, sanding, layers, and so on, and then I'd be able to kind of give it a real oldie worldy, old vibe kind of look. It turns out that in the end that I preferred it looking pretty rather than just old and knackered. And that's also the reason I've not taken the drawers out at this point to give them a staining. It's just so it's a rough base coat and then I can work on it from there. To try and make do with the drawer fronts as I have them and not with the frames that I'd thought about doing previously, I decided to get a round over on a couple of bits of scrap wood just to see what they'd look like. You can see, by the way, that the drawers are kind of midway through being kind of stained and sanded and stained and sanded at this point. But yeah, I'm just offering up some scrap to see what it would look like. And then took each drawer to the router table where I put a small round over every side of every drawer. Now I had to go over each of the roundovers and make sure that they were all nice and smooth as well. I also wrote inside the drawers exactly which position they were in the cabinet because I thought that it would just make sure that I didn't make any cock-ups when it came to the spacing again. Then it's on to staining each individual drawer. I wanted to make some kind of plinth or a stand for the unit to go on top of. That would allow me to have a little bit of storage space underneath. And let's face it, you can never have enough storage space. So yeah, I decided to cut some more pieces of wood, again from the same pine tabletop, and measure it up to get a rough idea of sizes. Once I'd done that, I got my 45-degree measuring jig out and made sure that the gauge for my bandsaw was set at 45 degrees so I could cut the mitered edges for the raised plinth stand thing. Once again, completely random measurements, but I just set this piece out so I could sort of look over it by eye and think, yeah, that's the amount of space that I want at the top, that's the amount I want at the bottom, and away we go. Then I could transfer that onto all four pieces. I used this this large sort of washer, which came from an old miter saw, I think, and that gave me the size curve that I wanted to use, which I tried to stick to, and it wasn't too bad. Now back onto the bandsaw to cut those curves out, and I've got to say that Jimmy DeResta has got a fantastic video on his channel about cutting curves out with sort of thick blades on the bandsaw. I, however, ignored all of that, forgot everything, and kind of made a bit of a hash of this, but it wasn't too bad. It was enough that I could sort of cover up in the important places later on down the line. But yeah, I would strongly advise going and checking out DeResta's channel for that, because I made a pig's ear of this one. It just meant that I had to get things back to the bench and then go over them with the rasp and then a file just to try and smooth things out from the absolute monstrosity I'd made on the bandsaw. Unsurprisingly, the miters that I cut on the bandsaw weren't the best, so I then made my own filler out of using some Titebond as well as some shavings or some dust that had been accumulated from when I took the drawer fronts to the router, so I could just sprinkle that in the glue, mix it all up, and then fill that into the gaps, and that would allow me to have a sort of a nice, relatively tidy finish when it was all done and dusted. Once I'd stuck it all together, I then went over to the router table and rounded off all of the lower edges. I didn't round off the top, and that means that it was going to be flush with the unit, the drawer unit that sits on top. I didn't want to have sort of competing curves going off on that one, if that makes any sense at all. That then had a sanding, and then I covered it over with the stain, just like I did with the top. Somehow I didn't film this section, but you can see that I've got spaces that I've just glued into place at the moment, and that allows me to put each drawer in individually, and it doesn't rack to one side or the other, and it just makes sure that everything is equally spaced. Once that's all done, all the drawers are going in once again just to see what it looks like with the roundovers over it, and once again another sanding. This happened quite a lot. At this stage, I was still thinking that I was going to be giving it an aged, old, vintage kind of look. And you can see on the side there that I'm kind of building up around that glue line and around where the nails went. And it kind of has that oldie-worldy kind of vibe. And that's exactly what I thought was going to be happening. But at this stage, I'm just doing a little bit of stain on the inside of the drawers and on the sort of block pieces just to tidy things up a wee bit. Now, what I'm doing here is driving in some little sort of blocks onto the underside of the cabinet, and that means that the plinth is going to sit nice and square and not rock around. I'm not going to have the top drawers sort of slide off the stand for it, you know. Now it was time to start worrying about how I was going to make the drawer pulls, because I couldn't do the face-framed jobbies with the horizontal pulls that I had originally anticipated. I now had to figure out a new way of doing things. And I decided that I wanted to use copper coins, 1p and 2p pieces in fact. And I thought that that would be kind of an old cool kind of, you know, connection to the past, if you like, a little bit. So I cleaned up a bunch of copper coins, and I figured that they'd go on nice and shiny, and then they'd naturally patina with age and with use from the you bringing out screws as I'm sort of making various projects over time. I thought that would be kind of cool. It did mean that I did have to think about how I was going to attach them to the drawers though. I tried Aralditing and JB welding screws to the back of coins overnight, and the next day I was still able to pull them apart pretty easily. So I decided that seeing as I'd sorted out the lathe, I may as well get using that one. So my original idea was to use some pine once again from the table, and this was going to allow me to turn down some kind of dowel size bits that I was going to use to mount the coins onto the front of the drawers. However, I didn't want to just glue it to the front, and because they were quite small, I didn't want to risk splitting with putting screws in there. So I had to come up with another idea, and that led me to the idea of having two sizes within each dowel piece, if you like, and the smaller piece would be able to be inset within the drawer and glued in, which would keep everything nice and solid but still be relatively roughy-tufty when it comes to holding on to the coins. Each individual knob then had to be cut off the stick of knobs. Then I got the small plane out, small little block plane, and started using the shooting board properly and making sure that I had a nice flat surface for the coin to stick to. And I did that on every single one of them, which was a little bit time consuming, but I think worthwhile, because I didn't want all of the coins being kind of random angles. And because it was they're so small, it would have been very, very easy to accomplish that. But yeah, getting them all on the shooting board meant that I got nice flat surfaces for each coin to sit on. Because I'm still super new on a lathe, I didn't manage to get all of the smaller sections that were going to fit into the drawer fronts all exactly the same. And so I had to think of a little way of making sure that I could attach them. So I used this piece of scrap drawer front that I'd done some testing on, and a stepped drill bit. And that means that if I could put a 6mm hole in each drawer front right in the middle where it needed to be, then I could use the stepped bit just to make sure that I could easily get each knob in their own little custom size so they'd fit properly. Then it's on to the easy bit, getting a bit of stain on all the knobs. And oh, well, it should have been the easy bit. After a quick cleanup, I then used a pair of pliers and just got each knob and just doused it in the stain. Made life a lot easier rather than trying to paint each individual one. It doesn't have to be on the actual bottoms or the little piece that's going in the drawer front, but yeah, this was just the easiest way, and my hands weren't doing too clever at this point in time. So picking up each individual one to paint it wasn't really ideal. To make sure that I got the coins onto the wood pieces quite comfortably, I used some Araldite 2-part epoxy. That makes things nice and simple to do. Now, I know it didn't do a fantastic job when it came to sticking the coins to the screw heads, but I figured with this instance, it might be a little bit better because there's a larger surface area, but also the epoxy can kind of seep into the wood a little bit to really grab hold. I did have to do my best here to make sure that I centered things as much as possible, and I don't think I did a terrible job, but I knew that it would be very easy to make things look very, very off very, very quickly. So yeah, just a little bit of care taken here. I got the centre of each drawer front just by putting a straight edge between each corner, and that was going to allow me to figure out where I was going to put the holes. I got a punch and put a little indentation in the centre of each cross. That just gave me a starting point where the drill bit should go, because I can't be trusted otherwise and they would end up all over the place. In go the 6mm holes. Everything had yet another coat of stain, and I think it was around about this point that I thought, do you know what, it's actually looking pretty nice. Maybe I don't want to just age the pants off it to make it look really kind of old and knackered. Maybe I just want to make something nice for a change. Then it was just a case of putting each individual drawer into the vise, making the hole the right size to fit each individual dowel, and then gluing it in place, hammering it home just to make sure that it wasn't going to go anywhere, and that was all that was needed. I picked up some of this whatever it's called, wax polish from Libron, I think, in the dark oak from Forgefix, because it was way cheaper than Bry wax. In my misspent youth, I was a bit of a goth at one point in time, so the smell of patchouli has a very special place in my heart, and this kind of reminded me of that. I don't know if that's what's in there, but it certainly reminded me of that. So I'd smothered the whole thing on, and then at this point you can see me just wiping it off and putting all the drawers back into place. What I'm doing right here is just taking each individual box of screws and then cutting out the face of the box, which is the bit that has the sizing on it. I did originally want this on these little sort of card things on the outside to give it the sort of the vintage vibe I was looking for. But unfortunately, those card holders that I originally got were far too big and just couldn't cope. So for the time being, I'm just making sure that I get each size of screw visible, so when I do run out, or when I am getting close to running out, I know what I need to reorder. And that's it. That's how I made my little screw holding box. It didn't go to plan. However, I think it came out looking pretty sweet. And for me, it's certainly something that's one of the nicer things that I've made. But yeah, there are certain things that I would change. I would absolutely redo that side panel. I would absolutely spend more time making the actual drawers so they look nicer. But overall, though, I think it's been a fantastic experience. I've learned a lot from doing this, and hopefully this is the start of me starting to make some nicer bits and bobs here and there. So yeah, we'll see how that all pans out moving forward. But thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this, please do give me a like and subscribe. I know it's been a long one, but I really appreciate you watching. Thank you very much indeed. See you soon. Bye-bye.